Okay, so why is Islamic hedging important? Well, we keep on hearing about wonderful growth rates of 15 to 25% year on year, a $1 trillion industry. But hedging is important because this rapid increase has actually caused a mismatch in assets and liabilities, and hedging is a way to minimize those mismatches. You have $150 billion worth of revenues from non-oil and gas corporates, Islamic corporates out there. They need to manage their assets and liabilities somehow. They have FX risk, they have commodity risk. Islamic hedging is a necessity. You also have new institutions and new Islamic hedge funds and Islamic institutions like the King Faisal Foundation Fund, who also need to manage their risk when they're investing in big capital projects. So this is why we need this. Okay, so what's the background? What have we been doing pre-1st of March 2010? Well, there has been an ongoing theological debate as to whether we can have Islamic derivatives in the first place. If you look at Mazir, Garan, Riba, the three Islamic tenets, you might think, well, actually, we can't even do Islamic derivatives. But while we've had this theological debate on the one hand, we have been seeing an embryonic stage of an Islamic derivatives market. If you go to places like Malaysia, for example, they developed a profit rate swap 6 years ago, which is like an interest rate swap. We've seen commodity index linked derivatives. We've seen cross-currency swaps. So on one hand, you've had the theological debate, and on the other hand, you've actually seen an embryonic market. I think actually what happened with Lehman's is actually quite a good thing for the Islamic finance community, because what it did was actually increase awareness of the need for hedging. And I think it's quite a fair assumption to say now that many Sharia scholars will accept hedging as a risk management tool. So there are certain specific parameters. But when we talk about hedging, what do I actually mean? Well, Tahawwut in Arabic actually means hedging. But when I'm talking to conventional derivative lawyers, what I'm talking about is hedging real risks. There has to be an underlying transaction. We're not talking about synthetic exposures. So let's think of a really simple example. Let's say you are an importer of cars. You are buying BMWs from Germany in euros and you are selling them in dirhams in Dubai. You will need some sort of hedge to manage that exposure to FX risk. That is what a derivative can do in this particular situation. That is a real transaction. It's for a real person. It's for a real business. Now, in the conventional derivative market, only 10% of the conventional derivative market is for real hedging purposes. 90% of it is for speculation and arbitrage. We're not talking about that 90%. We're only talking about that 10% of the market. Now, in notional terms, what does that mean? Well, the conventional derivative market at the end of 2009 was worth around $4 trillion. Even 10% of that is $400 billion. So this is not a small market and it's not a small potential. Okay, so why have we needed the standardization? Well, I think as Warren sort of nicely pointed out, up until now, we've had a number of bespoke documentation in the Islamic finance world. So you've got Deutsche Bank, you've got Merrill's, you've got Goldman Sachs. Everyone is doing their own trades, Islamic trades, on their own set of documentation. Now, this is great in some ways for the lawyers, but it's not great for the market as a whole. Because first and foremost, there's a cost of evaluating and negotiating this bespoke documentation. Every time a trader wants to do, let's say, a cross-currency swap, it has to sit around the table with a bunch of other people and discuss what really should be standard terms. So what we end up having is price divergence from conventional products. So it's actually one of the reasons why an Islamic cross-currency swap is more expensive than a conventional cross-currency swap. We don't want that. We actually want price convergence between the conventional products. In addition, if you have lots of bespoke documentation, you're not going to have balanced documentation, are you? It goes against the ISDA principles, but it also goes against Islamic finance principles of equity and fairness. And thirdly, you're going to have basis risk. If you have a proliferation of different documents out there, you are not going to have matching terms. So basis risk will enter into your transactions. What we hope the ISDA IIFM Tahawwut Master Agreement would do would bring efficiency, liquidity and certainty to the Islamic derivatives market. Exactly what the 92 ISDA did for the conventional market. So we can get to a critical mass in this area. Okay, so this is a very pretty picture of what the conventional ISDA architecture looks like on the left-hand side. And then you have on the right-hand side what the ISDA IIFM Tahawwut Master Agreement looks like. They're very, very different structures. In our ISDA IIFM Tahawwut Master Agreement, you have a master agreement and you have two sets of confirmations feeding into that master agreement. You have a confirmation that documents concluded transactions and a confirmation which is called a designated future confirmation that documents transactions that will happen in the future. And it's very important to actually just see visually how different this structure is from the conventional master agreement. It sits outside the conventional derivative model. Now, when we were drafting the ISDA IIFM Tahawwut Master Agreement, we had to start with the basis, and we started with the 2002 Master Agreement. So in form and structure, it's very similar, and it needs to be for conventional derivative lawyers to find it acceptable and understandable to use. But obviously, there are very, very different points of structure. And those are actually in a synopsis in points 1 to 8 on those slides. So these are the main differences from a conventional derivative structure. So if I'm just going through some of those salient features, first and foremost, the ISDA IIFM Tahawwut Master Agreement is a multi-product agreement. All Murabaha, Musawama and WAD-based products can be documented on this master agreement. This is very different to what we've had up until now. Before, we were having master agreements for Murabahas, master agreements for Salam, master agreements for Arbuns. Now you can document everything on the one master agreement. Now, Salam and Arbun, haven't been used as much as they could be used in Islamic derivatives, but it's more than likely that you can actually document this on this agreement as well. We haven't done the theological analysis of that yet, but technically, I see no reason why we couldn't use those products as well. The master agreement is to be used by all market participants in all geographical areas. This is very, very important. It means it's pan-madhab. Now, as most of you know, there are essentially 5 schools of jurisprudence in Islamic finance, and they're loosely linked to geographical areas. So, for example, you have the Hanbali School of Law in the GCC, you have the Shafi School of Law in Malaysia. These schools of law actually dictate the type of transactions you can do in a specific region. So they're very, very important. So if I give you a live example, the Arbun Murabaha structure, which was used by Sharia Capital on their short selling platform, is recognized on the Hanbali School of Law. Hence, you can do those structures in the GCC. The question is, can you then export that same structure to somewhere like Malaysia under the Shafi School of Law? I don't know. You've been doing this for 13 years, and I don't know the answer to that. The point is, if you have a master agreement that's pan-madhab, that actually spreads and can be used around the world by different participants, that is a very important tool. And that's what we have with this master agreement. We've got a series of different scholars from different jurisdictions, from different schools of jurisprudence who have signed off on this. As I mentioned earlier, the ISDA IIFM Tahawwut Master Agreement is not part of the ISDA modular library, so it sits outside the conventional derivative structure. So you couldn't use it with the credit defs or the equity defs or the commodity definitions. Those would all need to be looked at very individually and to see if we can actually be able to have a sort of a marrying of definitions. And I think most importantly, what we've done with this new agreement is we've hardwired into the agreement this concept of transactions and designated future transactions. Now, transactions are live transactions, they're concluded transactions, and they're documented under a confirmation. So to give you an example, it's where a murabaha, for example, is where you've delivered the asset, but the price is yet to be paid. That's a transaction. A designated future transaction is something that will happen in the future. It hasn't happened yet. So for example, it's where under a murabaha, you have neither delivered your asset and neither have you paid your deferred purchase price. And this dichotomy is prevalent throughout the ISDA-IIFM Tahawwut Master Agreement. It's very important to remember there are transactions and designated future transactions. Now, even though we have this dichotomy, both transactions and designated future transactions come within the ISDA technology of single agreement, the flawed asset concept, representations, undertakings, and relevant events of default and termination events, and of course the closeout mechanism. I think I touched upon very briefly the concept that we had actually drafted an explanatory memo, and it's very useful just to have, if you're a new market participant in this area, to have a read of that explanatory memo. It's a user's guide, I would say, to how to use the agreement. There are some specific points which are worthwhile pointing out, actually. In the explanatory memo, we actually specifically state that this master agreement can only be used for hedging purposes. So it's only going to be used for that 10% of that conventional market where you have real transactions. You do not have synthetic exposures. Secondly, it specifically states, and we've specifically drafted this in, that any kind of speculative transaction cannot be documented on this master agreement. So you cannot do speculative transactions on here. Thirdly, transactions must be real transactions involving the actual transfer of ownership of real assets, actual risk, and real settlement. Now, what that means is that earlier in this industry, we used to have swaps or Islamic derivatives that kind of used a Islamic loan type model. No, we are moving away from that Islamic loan type model. These are Islamic derivatives that have real derivative cash flows. This is very important for tax and accountancy reasons. If you want to structure an Islamic derivative, certainly under English law, you want it to be treated for tax purposes and accountancy purposes as a derivative. Otherwise, you're not having the benefit of what that structure is meant to do. Fourthly, the asset that underlines that Islamic derivative needs to be halal. So for example, up until now, we have used mainly LME traded metals to actually facilitate cash flows that replicate conventional derivatives. However, in some jurisdictions like Malaysia, they've started to use things like palm oil, aluminium, minerals. These particular types of products are Sharia compliant, they're commodities, they're easy to source, and they're cheap. And they actually support the local economy as well. So while in the GCC, they tend to use LME traded metals where you have warrants flying around the system, you do in Malaysia have a more local economy supporting the infrastructure.